Greetings, listeners. You're listening to colourfulradio.com online and on DAB, and a very warm welcome from me, Kenneth Tharp. I'm here to tell you about the forthcoming African concert series and also welcome a very special guest. But before I introduce you to our special guest, let me just tell you a little bit about the African concert series. In 2019, the award-winning Nigerian-Romanian pianist Rebecca Amodia launched the world's first ever African concert series in London, featuring 10 monthly concerts in various venues, including the October Gallery and the Africa Centre. Described by the BBC World Service as "The African Art Music Makes a Comeback," the programme of the series reflects the depth and diversity of what is known as African art music, the richly diverse genre of music which forms a bridge between Western classical music and traditional African music. I'm delighted to say that I've been a big fan of the series and of its founder, Rebecca Amodia, who is herself an outstanding classical pianist. And I'm also delighted to say that as former director of the Africa Centre, we were really delighted to host the final 3 concerts in the 2019 series. And I'm pleased to say that the Africa Centre is supporting this forthcoming series, which includes 2 concerts from members of the fabulous Chineke Orchestra and the Nigerian pianist Glenn Inanga, both of whom played at the Africa Centre as part of the first series. Yes, you can find out more about the African concert series on www.africanconcertseries.co.uk. You can follow them on Instagram, the African Concert Series, and on Twitter at African Series. The forthcoming series of concerts will be streamed from the Africa Centre and the Cayman Islands via the Africa Concert Series Facebook page and YouTube channels. Do follow the Africa Centre, do follow African Concert Series, and do follow Colourful Radio on all the channels. The Chineke Foundation, by the way, was set up by renowned double bassist Chichi Nwanoku to champion change and diversity in classical music. And that really brings us to the heart of why this concert series is so important. Classical music, a bit like classical ballet, have been perceived, I think, for way too long as genre of music largely dominated by one homogenous group of people. Or put it another way, it's been very normal to enter a concert hall anywhere in the UK and not see a single Black musician on stage. Much of the music that's played is dominated by dead white men. And if you said that there are classical composers stemming from across the African continent, even well-educated music folk might raise an eyebrow in surprise. So for me, the first African concert series was an absolute revelation and exposed me to classical music that I never knew existed. So please do look out for the series of concerts in the forthcoming series. Now, my special guest this afternoon is a composer, a producer, a songwriter, and a multi-instrumentalist across a variety of musical genres that include contemporary music and pop, but most notably Western classical music and African classical music. His work has changed the face of classical and contemporary music in Europe and Africa, and we'll talk more on that later. Born in England, he is also of Nigerian descent, and as a child traveled to West Africa, to the Gambia, to study the Griot tradition, to learn the art of the Kora from the master Amadou Bansang Jobate. And as if that in itself wasn't enough, he also studied classical music at the Purcell School of Music in London, where he learned the cello. He's also founder of several ensembles, including the Art Ensemble of Lagos and the African Classical Music Ensemble. In recent years, he's been artistic director of Muson Centre in Lagos, one of West Africa's only music conservatoires specializing in classical music. He also set up the NOK Foundation, spelled capital N-O-K, a charitable organization dedicated to raising consciousness through music, art, and culture. Now, so unusual is my guest's musical biography that some listeners may have already guessed whom I'm talking about. I'm lucky enough to have seen him perform on a number of occasions, the last time almost exactly a year ago in London, performing with the NOK String Orchestra. I am a big fan. I am delighted to welcome on air, speaking also from London, the supremely talented Tunde Jegede. Tunde, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Tunde, look, we're here first and foremost to talk about music and your forthcoming concert in the African Concert Series. But before we get stuck in, look, we are living in such extraordinary times at the moment, challenging, unsettling, and uncertain times. So please let me just begin by asking you, how are you? And how has your life been since the start of the pandemic?
Wow, it certainly has been a big shift for everybody, certainly for the arts. I think back in March last year, I think we were in the midst, we just finished the tour by the 14th, I remember it was by about the 14th or 20th of March, we finished this last tour that we were doing. And immediately as the tour was going on, we came into that first lockdown. And as we started that tour, everything was normal. And as we got to the end of that tour, people were talking about social distancing and all kinds of things gradually. And as the tour, but once we got to the end of the tour, we were pretty much in a very different world. And then we went straight into this lockdown.
I'm sorry, Tunde, when you say we, who were you touring with?
At that time, it was an ensemble with a Butoh dancer, two dancers, a visual artist and a Butoh dancer. It was a production called Who Am I? Ironically enough. And it was exploring identity and kind of delving into, through art and music, who we are and what makes us who we are. And funnily enough, there was a song in it and people were saying it was very appropriate for the time. And as I said, when we started, I didn't really, it gradually grew as the tour went on. And as I said, when we came out of that, literally we went into the first lockdown. And I think for artists, I guess it's been different for different people, but certainly for artists, it's meant that one has had to question what you do, why you do it, how you do it. The why really, because everything has shifted. Obviously, it's a very challenging time, and certainly with so many people passing away in it, it is what it is. But with that challenge also comes, questioning. You have to question what you do, what the role of art is, what the role of music is. And sometimes that's not a bad thing on a personal thing, to be challenged in that way, to have to rise to a new challenge, to see, what's the essence of what you do and why you do it. Because in a way, sometimes you can be on a treadmill of going around, doing things without always questioning why. And suddenly one had to ask the question, why and what do we do? And what is, what's its importance? What's its relevance in people's lives?
You've right at the beginning of this interview, you've anticipated a question I was probably going to ask you later, which is, what do you think the role of the artist was? I don't think I can find it immediately to hand, but there's a wonderful quote in a book by Tom Robbins, in a book called Another Roadside Attraction, when he talks, the young character Amanda is walking through her cactus garden. She comes across an old Navajo man painting pictures in the sand, and she says to him, what is the function of the artist? And he said, the function of the artist is to provide what life does not.
Wow. Yeah, I think it's definitely made, as I said, different artists I've talked to, they kind of question many things. It's like now we're speaking, it's like, what was the importance of live music? Now, we all had, in a way, we sometimes took that for granted. What does it give that we don't get in recordings, that we don't get, say, in a virtual environment? And suddenly we're now having to address those things because we're faced in a situation where we don't have live music, we don't have live art. I would go to exhibitions to get inspiration for music. And London is one of those places in the world which has an amazing spread of, museums, galleries, exhibitions, all these things. Suddenly there's none of that. You go around the city, but you can't go to an exhibition. You can't go and see, well, you can, now we're talking about a concert. So you can experience them, but not really easily in person. And I think a lot of audiences have had to question what that means for them. And a lot of artists have had to question, what does that mean at their end? And so, it's been 12 months of, really addressing some of those fundamentals. But I guess
Sorry, Tony. I was going to say, you talked about your inspirations, and we'll come later to what inspires you to write. But I would love to just go back to the beginning and assume that our listeners don't know anything about you. And could you tell us about how you started? Where and when did you start your musical journey?
Wow. I think at the beginning, I was told that, I mean, literally at the beginning, I was told that before I spoke, I was playing. I was playing percussion, I was playing drums. That was my favorite toy. I probably was banging more than playing, if we, if we want to have a precise description. But yeah, I remember that from the very beginning. So like, I think I did my first radio performance at 5 years old on drums for a broadcaster at the time called Alex Pascal. So that was my beginnings in music, was percussion. My father played percussion. He was a poet as well as a visual artist. So I think music was really something that it was almost an extension of, you know, language, and music was another language, really. And that's before I was playing kora and cello. I started kora and cello at the age of 7. And funnily enough, when I started the kora and started studying the cello, I stopped playing percussion. I still don't know, actually, I still don't know why, but I stopped playing percussion from then all the way till I was at music college at Guildhall. And one day I saw 2 congas, and I said, don't ask me why, I suddenly went, oh yeah, I used to play those. And then I just started playing percussion again. Very bizarre, but I never touched percussion all the time I was doing cello and kora, because I was so focused in, you know, there's so much demanding. I left the percussion thing. Odd, but it was always there, and I guess it visited in the music anyway.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. And I think particularly because certainly when I was growing up, I think if you said African music, and I know that is such a broad term that you could wince at it, but I think many people associated drumming with African music, and I think what your journey, encaptures, and mine too, to a certain extent. Is that there is a hugely rich melodic tradition within African music. And that's where you began yours. Did you start playing the kora and the cello simultaneously, or did you start with one and then the other?
Yeah, it was funny because I think I started the instruments within like 2 or 3 months of each other, but it's just as it happened, because the kora, I'd heard a visiting Senegalese kora player called Bully Sissoko, who was here in London at that time. Bully Sissoko and another kora player, Sarah Pereira. There was 2 of them. And they actually at one point were staying with my father, so they were quite close quarters. But when I heard the kora, I was just drawn to the sound. It has a magical sound. I don't think any other instrument sounds quite like the kora. And so I was just drawn to the sound and wanted to play that. And I had a kora because Bully had given my family a kora. And I was saying I was playing it. I was trying to play it without any teaching at that point. And again, just drawn to the sound, just trying to play that instrument. Then with the cello, I remember I was at school.
Sorry, Tunde, forgive me for interrupting. Just in case some of our listeners are going, well, I don't really know what the kora is. Could you describe it? I mean, it's sometimes described as an African harp, isn't it?
I think the kora, I would say the kora, the 21-stringed West African harp lute. It's almost, I mean, I don't know whether it is a cross between a harp or a lute. I mean, people say it's closer to a harp, but in the definitions, they say harp lute. But yeah, and from Gambia, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, that region of West Africa, the people that the instrument tradition comes from is the Mande people. So they're people within West Africa. And you said something about drums. And I remember that in a lot of concerts, I used to always do a disclaimer early on, or be clear with certain things. One of them was that Africa is a continent of which there are at least 700 peoples and over 700 distinct cultures, languages, etc., of which the kora is from one, to contextualize that in the first place. And then secondly, that in the kora tradition and in with the family that I studied with, the Djibouti family, in particular Amadou Bansang, if you brought the drums into the compound, you would then leave. So for people that, you know, when people will then, you know, say, oh, yeah, African drums and drumming, it was not allowed when I was studying for drums or the djembe or whatever with the kora. Now, obviously you see that today, but I'm telling you what I know from when I was small. He would not permit you to play kora with drums. That is complete no-no. So these are things, you know, they're misconceptions, because when you come to the West, you say African, you say, oh yeah, drumming, or you say African music, which is a bit like saying, oh, the symphony orchestra, timpani, which, yeah, no, timpani is important, but obviously there are also strings and wind and brass and choir, and you can't just focus on one part of the orchestra as representative of a musical universe.
Absolutely. And, you know, the instrument, you know, when I've seen you playing it and other players, I mean, it is, you know, it has a long neck, a very long neck, and then a big gourd, a rounded sort of body, which amplifies the sound. And am I right in saying 21 strings?
21 strings, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's a very beautiful, visually appealing instrument, and not just anyone can pick it up and play it. I mean, it really is the Griot tradition, and the family tradition is something very particular, isn't it? But let's come back to that, and I think maybe it's time to give our listeners just a taste. And I think you've got a track that you'd like to play called Reflections. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is from a new recording that I've just, well, I finished a while ago now, but it's going to be released later this year, called Moon Waters, and this is the second track on that album. This album was exploring. It was actually recorded before the pandemic, but I was really this album was exploring a journey of reflection, a journey of meditation. It's a very meditative album. It goes through, so I guess it's relevant for these times, but it was recorded before these times. And yeah, Reflections is just, well, I guess what it's saying is reflecting on the moment that music was being played.
Brilliant. Let's have a listen. Tunde, that was beautiful and very reflective. We just before the piece of music, we touched on the Griot tradition, and it is a tradition, but it's a very different one to Western classical music, because it's more than just the music, isn't it? Tell us a little bit, just to give people an insight.
Exactly. It's much more than music. That's why, in a way, one had to go there to study that tradition, because it's not just notes. It's a way of life. It's an approach to life. It's an approach to music. And I think what I was lucky with in my musical education, I feel, was that I had a Western classical education musically, and I delved into everything that involved. And I also delved into an African classical tradition and what that involved in terms of the perspective on music, the perspective on sound, its role within a society. That most of the griots, some lean on the instrumentation, some lean on the vocal tradition. The vocal tradition is really about the history, the genealogy of the people, using what we know from history to comment on the present. So it's not just talking about history as a past tense, it's using that history to say, what can we learn from history? Where do we go from here? And so the griots are masters of that, of, if you like, manipulating the present moment to bring people together in a certain way. That's what, you know, it's the cohesive element of music or arts, is really to bring cohesion to society. And in a way, hopefully they're being able to do that in this present moment as well.
I'm going to draw my own performing background as a dancer, I suppose, in framing my next question. I started classical ballet at the age of 5. And then at 18, I suppose I switched to contemporary dance. And I do remember someone who's now a distinguished choreographer in his own right, but a friend of mine then called Russell Malafan, who observed when he was studying contemporary dance at the Royal Ballet School, that he said, contemporary dance is not just a different way of moving, it's a different way of thinking. As someone who was studying almost inhabiting these two parallel worlds of the classical cello and the kora, did you feel, there's a number of questions I could ask. One, did you feel any sense of conflict created by these different traditions? And also, was it, and this maybe brings us to the present as well, do you feel that, is it a kind of schizophrenia where you switch between completely different worlds, or do you feel that somehow they are so embodied in you that that's no longer an issue?
That was the exact word that I was about to say, and then you've said it already. The word was schizophrenia. The schizophrenia in terms of when one was learning for big periods of it, but obviously what you're talking about, the same parallels in terms of dance, ballet and contemporary, very different methodologies, very different approaches. It's the thinking that's different, not so much the music. People think, oh, this music with that music. It's not the music that's the problem, it's how we see the music, how we think, the approach. And so often when I'm working with classical musicians and they say there's a problem accessing rhythmically or whatever the African musical world or universe, that's always mostly a psychological, mental thing. It's not they can't play their instrument or they can't play the music. It's having to move them to a different way of thinking. And once they embrace that, they can then play the music. So that's a critical thing. But then for me, I'm able to unlock that in others because I went through that over a long period. When I was studying the kora, I was completely inside that tradition, in that world, you know, in that universe. Then when I was in the Western classical tradition, I was completely in that universe. And then obviously, sometimes I would come to the Africa Center as a child to perform with people like African Dawn very early. That's the first place I actually performed the kora, funnily enough. And so at night I'd perform, say, at Africa Center with African Dawn and Last Poets and a lot of these radical, you know, groups from the African Black musical world. And then the next morning I'd be doing, you know, Baroque music, you know, at school. As you can imagine, that's quite a schizophrenic existence for someone who's very young, you know, for someone, you know, in my teens, and then you're trying to work out who you are and where you are. And, so yeah, it was schizophrenic because you kind of have to exist in all these different parallel universes. What I think happens gradually over the course of the journey is you start to think, am I going to go into my adulthood in this schizophrenic manner? Or am I somehow going to find a way to unify these things so that I can sit as a unified being? And so gradually you start to go, okay. And I think the beginnings of that was the kora tradition early on was completely different. It was nothing to do with the cello, and the same the other way. Obviously, I could hear connections. Say you can hear Bach, you can hear Baroque music, you can hear some parallels, which say other people who are not exposed to that won't hear those connections. But I'm talking more about your unified life. It is very difficult at that point. I think when I discovered jazz, I discovered other forms of African diasporic music forms like reggae, jazz, outside of my immediate experience. For some reason that helped because I started to play cello in a jazz trio at school, and I was playing pitch cello as bass. So then that immediately gave me a different way of looking at the cello. I mean, it didn't go down too well when my cello teacher saw me doing that at school. But those he's like, what is he doing? Why is he doing that? Trying to be a bass player on a cello in a jazz trio when he's supposed to be doing, I don't know, Shostakovich or whatever.
And so today, were you plucking it or were you bowing it?
I was plucking it. I was playing it as a bass.
Okay.
I was playing it as a bass, literally. I was the bass, but on the cello. And it sounds weird. And I was like 14, 15, because I was listening to Wynton Marsalis. I was listening to people like Courtney Pine at the time, Journey to the Urge Within. Those jazz warriors came out at that time, very influential. So with all of that, that was the beginning of kind of taking the cello outside of classical music. Then I was starting to do the kora in that jazz trio, trying to improvise in a very different way from, say, so that gave beginnings of an avenue to somewhere else. And then I met Courtney Pine, I met the Jazz Warriors. I was then in Orphy Robinson's group, a group called Anavas. So bit by bit, I went into the jazz scene for a bit, but I wasn't a jazz musician and I knew that. So I was in the jazz scene, but not a jazz musician. But there was a lot of things I found interesting there, the improvisation, the youthful energy, because a lot of the guys then were young and they were like fresh, they were doing their new music, people couldn't define what it was, all of that. And then there were the exiled South Africans like Begi Mezeleku, Russell Herman, Eugene, there was different scenes, Dudu Pukwana. There was a lot of things going on, especially if you're younger than them, and you're seeing all these different things. And again, you're just trying to make sense of it all. And it starts to penetrate, gradually it starts to penetrate your music, or how you see music.
Yeah. That's a remarkable journey. And I really don't think I know anyone else who has sort of, in a way, embodied those two quite different worlds. And, I don't know if at any stage someone said, look, you better decide which one you want to do and concentrate on one. I could imagine you're nodding. I could see it. I'm not surprised. One thing I'll share with you, I don't know if you would have seen this. It was many years ago now, but there was an amazing television documentary with Yo-Yo Ma when he went to stay with the Kalahari Bushmen. And you're nodding. And a couple of scenes in that I remember, but one was that just brought out this difference in mindset. One was he wanted to go and practice, and he thought, let me go and find a quiet place at the edge of the village, under a tree, and practice. And the kids followed him, and as soon as he started playing, he had an audience. And for them, the concept of I'm practicing as opposed to I'm performing didn't really exist. He was either playing or he wasn't.
I think that film that you're pulling up is a brilliant example, and it's one that a lot of musicians should look at. I remember seeing that same documentary and it having an impact. And I actually met Yo-Yo Ma more recently when I was in the States. He's a very, very open musician and a very open mind. And I think when you have that open mind and that open approach, that's when you can really learn and penetrate other traditions. But it is that concept. I found that funny at the time because it was around that same time when I was doing a documentary for BBC, and they came with me to the Gambia. And I remember the producer of the film saying, it's going to be, I want to film you playing Bach to my teacher, Amadou. And that's going to be an amazing moment in the film where he hears me playing Bach to him. But actually, in the same way as Yo-Yo Ma kind of learned certain things through that process, I also learned in that journey that actually music is connected to environment, music is connected to the society, music's connected to the cultural environment. And actually, if you just played Bach suites to somebody in the middle of Kembaje village in the middle of Gambia, it's fine, but it doesn't really have the impact you think it will have because it doesn't have the meaning. And that's when I realized how important the music and the environment and the context is. You can't just drop in something somewhere and because my teacher, he said, that's really nice, that's great. And that was it. And I think he was expecting, I don't know, revelation or 7 angels to drop from heaven, and that definitely didn't happen because it's just like, yeah, that's really nice. Okay, next. That reality is important. Is an important reality check, because they have their world, they have their universe. They don't need Western classical music, and vice versa. It's just, what's interesting is when you look at these parallel universes, if that's part of your journey, that becomes interesting.
There is so much in what you've just said. One is that I think, and this happens too often in television sometimes, when people go in with, preconceived notions of what they think should happen or what they want to impose, rather than actually perhaps just observe what is happening. And the second is about context. Listen, we've been talking a lot about the cello. I think maybe it was time to hear one of your cello pieces, and I think you're going to play something from an existing album. Is it Song of the Eternal?
Songs of the Eternal. This piece is basically a piece that I chose because it represents me looking at an African tradition from the cello universe, from the cello world. So it's based on an instrument, the riti, the African one-string violin. So it draws a lot of phraseology and musical vocabulary from that. And also in the second half of the piece, I'm not sure we'll get to it, is the Ngoni, which is a pit, an African lute. So it's got those influences in it, but it's a piece written for solo cello.
Great. Tunde, I suppose, look, we were touching brief earlier on inspirations, and it's clear, I think you take your inspiration from so many different sources, but I mean, is there something concise you could say about what motivates you to compose?
I think it's different each time. I mean, sometimes it can be, I also write poetry, which I've done from an early age. So sometimes it can be literary inspiration. Sometimes it can be the visual arts. Both my parents were visual artists. I was surrounded by visual art, both African and Western. So many things. It can be the natural world. It depends. It depends on, so many things. Each piece is its own universe. It's just a huge question when you say what inspires those things. I think.
Well, let me ask one more question, which is, when you talked a moment ago very clearly about context. When you're composing, at the point of composing, are you thinking at that point about how you want the audience to engage with the music, or are you just dealing with the music on its own terms?
No, I think most of the process of composing for me, which can be, I've seen it with other composers historically as well, people get very nervous when you go, I'm still composing, but you're not writing anything or doing anything that they can see, because a lot of it goes on. It's like, no, I think it should be that. No, I think it should be that. And you have to hear the piece first, almost in its totality. And I'm not even just talking the notes. I'm talking, what do I want this piece to do? What do I want this piece to express? What do I want people to feel from, what's the energy of this creation? And then, funnily enough, the actual doing of it might be, a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks. It's like, bam, it's done. But actually, it could be months of, no, that's not right. It's going on inside. It's an internal journey. And obviously, I say that can make people nervous because they think you're not doing it. It's like when they see you writing, that's when you're doing it. But actually, that's not when you're doing it. You're doing it when as soon as I know, people want me to do this piece or whatever, and it's a commission, they say, what is it about? Then I hear what they think it's about, what they want. And then I'm thinking, okay, but what what is it that I'm doing, meeting what they want, and what is the thing, what is it about? And then the research for that could be very wide. Like the last piece I've just done, a piece based on, the Mayflower celebration, or the journey of that, and it was to do with migration. And, the inspiration from that could be from James Baldwin all the way to, it could be so many different things: Irish traditional music, Indian classical, it could be Nusrat Fateh. It's things people would never associate with the thing, because it depends what I've associated the journey with. Even Tarkovsky's films. I was looking at Tarkovsky's films, which are Russian, which got nothing to do with the topic I was doing, but it has everything to do, because if you find the final result, I can tell you where those elements are in the piece, but it's a musical piece, but I'm looking at a film. So it's understanding that the art is a very broad spectrum. You don't get inspiration from music by just listening to music. Often it's looking at exhibitions or the artists, or just great artists from across the spectrum.
I hear you. Listen, time is of the essence. I would love to just touch on one more thing, and maybe to lead us in possibly our last extra, which was when I saw your brilliant concert last year in London with the Knock Orchestra. It really did, for me, embody these. It was like the blending of these two musical traditions. Hearing the Kora against this body of against this background of string instruments, classical string instruments, was so particular and very, very beautiful, I must say. Maybe just tell us a very briefly, a tiny bit about your collaboration with the Knock Orchestra, and maybe we can listen to an excerpt from a piece that you've done with them.
Yeah, my journey with the Knock Orchestra began when I went to Mouzon as the artistic director there for 4 years. Was working with the Mouzon Orchestra, working with the choir and everything there. And the orchestra grew out of me working with a lot of the young students. And, we were doing Baroque music, Bach and Vivaldi in particular.
And this is in Lagos?
This is in Lagos, Nigeria. And also we were looking at the parallel of playing African repertoire, and this brings us to the art music. They were playing pieces from Nigerian composers, like Fela Shawande, people like Aya Bankole, and wider. There's others as well. Akin Yuba is another composer, people that we're familiar with, and also we did arrangements of Fela Kuti's songs for the orchestra. That was another. That went off very well in Lagos, as you can imagine. But the journey was really looking at how we can explore an African repertoire in the orchestral domain. And what was great working with them is the way they approach string and orchestral playing. They still carry a very Nigerian essence in terms of rhythmically, their musical vocabulary. And it's the first time I got to work with a big ensemble of players where you can suddenly, you don't have to tell them this thing swings like this. That's never going to be a conversation, really. In terms of rhythmically, you're working on other things like how we come in and out, and other things, sound and all the rest of it. And as I said, because over the years I've worked with orchestras from all around the world. I've worked with many of the great orchestras here in the UK and internationally in America and in Europe. But I have to say that they have a particular sound. They have and especially rhythmically, when that swings, it swings. And you can't get that swing. I'm sorry. You can't get that swing anywhere else. With due respect, we can play those pieces anywhere around the world, but there's a way they swing. I'm going to say that straight because it's the truth. They swing the music, and it's music that I've written it a long time ago, but there's certain things they bring to that energetically and all the rest of it that, it's special. And so I enjoy my collaboration with them.
Well, let's have a listen to you with the Knock Orchestra. Tunde, it was really great to hear you playing with the Nok Orchestra. Tell me, where does the name Nok come from?
Nok is basically an ancient African civilization from the Niger Delta, really, from the Nigerian region. And it's from antiquity. So that was a civilization from antiquity, from that region. So the orchestra was named after that.
Great, fantastic. Tunde, last question really from me. I'm really excited about your forthcoming concert. People are going to be engaging this with a particular way. It's going to be streamed. Is there anything you'd like to either tell them about the concert or tell them about how you'd like them to engage with it, albeit online?
Yeah, I wouldn't tell people how they should engage. I mean, I leave that to them. But I think from my perspective, what I'm going to still do, which is what I do in live concerts, is try to still follow the journey that I would do in a live concert. So hopefully, if they can be inside of that, they'll get the benefits of that journey in the same way that they would in a live concert. So if we can keep the spirit of that, I'll be happy. And it will be a journey, it'll be basically a journey from traditional West African music through the transition of those elements of African traditions onto the cello. And then the second half, Moon Waters, which is more of a contemporary interpretation of music on the kora from that tradition, but also new influences. So that's the overall arc, if you like, of the concert.
Tunde, we can't wait to hear your opening of this new African concert series. It's been a real joy and a real privilege talking to you. I've learned so much. I have still so many unanswered questions, but thank you for the African concert series, and thank you for the Colourful Radio.
Thank you.